Welcome to The Lead. I'm Jake Tapper. This hour, a wave of crime across the United States. Today, multiple families in mourning for loved ones killed in shootings in just the last 72 hours, including a 10-year-old boy. Plus, President Biden facing a make-or-break week for one of his massive spending proposals. The negotiations could set the tone for the rest of his presidency. And leading this hour, a CNN exclusive, we're going to play for you never-before-heard audio of a 2019 phone call now obtained by CNN. You will hear Trump lawyer Rudy Giuliani in the call relentlessly pushing a Ukrainian government official, Andrei Yermak, to investigate the baseless conspiracy theories about then-presidential candidate Joe Biden. You may recall the allegations that Donald Trump pressured Ukraine to investigate Biden in exchange for better relations and military aid. That was the central focus of Trump's first impeachment. Now, the partial transcript of this call became public earlier this year, but to hear the actual audio for the first time is quite stunning. The president's personal attorney telling a top aide to the Ukrainian president that if they want a better relationship with Trump, if they want to solve their problems with Trump, they needed to do what Giuliani was proposing and have a prosecutor publicly announce an investigation into Joe Biden. If you do this, you could get that. I think there's a term in Latin for that. CNN senior international correspondent Matthew Chance walks us through this quite damning recording.
What exactly do you mean?
Meaning meddling in the election.
It was the call that set events in motion.
Okay, so we should have on the line here America's mayor, Mayor Giuliani, and we have Andrei Yermak.
Thrusting a reluctant Ukraine into America's divided politics. We already know through transcripts and testimony, Giuliani pressured them to announce investigations important to then President Trump. But this is the first time we've heard his actual voice.
I want very much to see that our two countries are able to work together.
How Giuliani cajoled the Ukrainian presidential advisor on the other end of the line, first promoting debunked conspiracy theories that Ukraine, not Russia, was involved in US election meddling in 2016 and tried to hurt the Trump campaign.
Way back in last November, I got information from a reliable investigator, international investigator, that there was a certain amount of activity in Ukraine during the 2016 election that involved Ukrainian officials and mostly officials, being asked by our embassy and possibly by other American officials. Basically, I mean, the statement was to produce dirt on then candidate Trump and Paul Manafort.
By the time of the call in July 2019, Joe Biden had already emerged as the Democratic Party's frontrunner to challenge President Trump. And digging up dirt on Biden, like the unfounded allegations of corrupt dealings in Ukraine when he was vice president, had become a priority for Trump and his long-time advisor. Throughout the roughly 40-minute call, Giuliani repeatedly pressed the Ukrainian leadership to publicly announce investigations into this too, something that would have undoubtedly benefited Trump's re-election campaign and damaged candidate Biden. Listen to how Giuliani sets out what's required.
And all we need from the president is to say, I'm going to put an honest prosecutor in charge. He's going to investigate and dig up the evidence that presently exists, and is there any other evidence about involvement of the 2016 election? And then the Biden thing has to be run out. I don't know if it's true or not. I mean, I see him bragging about it on television. And to me as a lawyer, it sounds like a bribe. Somebody in Ukraine's got to take that seriously.
We ready this day immediately communicated to coordinate, to work and investigate everything which you listed.
But privately, Ukrainian officials say they were alarmed at being sucked into American politics, especially when Giuliani repeatedly suggested compliance would open the door to closer US-Ukrainian ties, even a presidential meeting, undermining the former US president's assertions that he never sought political favors from Ukraine to secure US support, so-called quid pro quo.
I want nothing. I want nothing. I want no quid pro quo.
Now we can hear Giuliani set out his offer.
So, if he could make some statement at the right time that he supports a fair, honest law enforcement system and that these investigations go wherever they have to go, it's going to be run by honest people, that would clear the air really well. And I think it would make it possible for me to come and make it possible, I think, for me to talk to the president and see what I can do about making sure that whatever misunderstandings are put aside. And maybe even, I kind of think that this could be a good thing for having a much better relationship where we really understand each other.
To my factual knowledge, they approached numerous...
One former Ukrainian official who was listening in on the call understood all too well. He spoke to CNN last month of his outrage as he heard Giuliani try to force a deal that, in his words, threatened Ukraine's national security.
Let me remind you, we're a country fighting an active war with Russia for many years. So anything to do with swapping, favors within our bilateral relationship in exchange for trying to get us involved into US domestic politics is just wrong on many levels, like morally, ethically, and probably even legally.
By call's end, the Ukrainian side seemed to understand exactly what President Zelensky of Ukraine was expected to do to keep Washington on side. And on the call, at least, they agreed.
I'm sure that Zelensky will say that, yeah.
Yeah, good. Second, that would, believe me, Andre, that would be good for all of us.
Giuliani has denied any wrongdoing in Ukraine and says he was just trying to help his personal client, Trump. It was, of course, this and other aggressive attempts to coax Ukraine, vigorously denied by then administration officials, that led to former President Trump's first impeachment, in which he was eventually acquitted by the US Senate. It's hard to know if actually hearing Giuliani relentlessly pressing Ukraine like this.
If he could say something like that, on his own in the conversation, it would go a long way. It would go a long way with the president to solve the problems.
Would have in any way influenced the outcome of the impeachment vote.
All right. Well, Jake, the Ukrainians, of course, never did announce any investigation into 2016 election meddling or, of course, into Joe Biden. And they paid a price for it because even though the White House unfroze the military aid to Ukraine, President Zelensky of Ukraine, he never got that invitation to the White House that he was looking for, something he valued because it was a show symbolically of support from the United States to Ukraine. Tonight, though, Jake, that's all changed because the Ukrainian president has, within the past few hours, announced that he has now finally been invited to the White House for the first time by President Biden in July. Back to you.
Matthew Chance, great reporting. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Let's discuss this rather stunning audio. Evan, we've read the transcript of this call, but it's one thing to read it. It's another thing to hear it, hear the inflections, hear the paragraphs, and it's very easy to see why somebody, especially Ukrainian officials, would interpret this as a quid pro quo. Giuliani very clearly says, if you do this, then this could happen. This has to do with an investigation being announced about the Bidens or Joe Biden, and this is better relations with the United States and with President Trump.
Right, and look, that's the definition of a quid pro quo, right? I mean, the idea that the Ukrainians, the aid that is key to their defense, to their survival, amid the Russian attacks that they have in the east of their country, that is tied, that the very important meeting with then President Trump was very important to them, for their foreign policy, and to have that tied to, they don't even, you could hear Giuliani say he doesn't care really whether it's true, or whether this is a real legitimate investigation. All he wants is an announcement. And what that tells you, Jake, is that this is, again, this goes to the classic use of disinformation techniques, right? Which is to put it out there, and then that sets upon the, you know, the gears to work for the conservative media to start feeding the frenzy, right? The feeding frenzy on Joe Biden and his candidacy. And then it doesn't matter whether this ends up being not true in a couple of years. The effect, right, is such that it would cripple his candidacy for the presidency.
And that context is so important because, as Matthew pointed out in his piece, his excellent piece, Joe Biden was the Democratic frontrunner for the nomination. Mm-hmm. What are the odds, do you think, Rudy Giuliani, Donald Trump would have cared about this if Biden weren't running for president and weren't seen as the biggest, and look, he was right, as the best chance the Democrats had to defeat him? Would Rudy Giuliani have been pushing for this if it was just citizen Biden sitting at home?
We know the answer to that, and the answer to that is no, because they didn't do it for the first 3 years of his presidency. If he cared that much, if he was that concerned, the former president, never mind Rudy Giuliani, just because it was a pure policy question, then they would have been doing it from the very beginning. No, it's because of the fact that Joe Biden they saw early on, before he was the nominee for the Democrats, as a very real threat. And as you said, they were right. And, you know, behind the scenes, people in and around the Trump campaign, they were very candid about the fact that they were worried about Joe Biden. And this is how it was playing out in an extremely nefarious way. As you said, for the Ukrainians, for whom this is not just a foreign policy question, this is a potential question about an existential threat to them because of Russia's aggression towards the Ukrainians.
And so we're hearing about this now. It's 2021.
Right.
Why weren't charges brought against, I mean, if this is at least potentially illegal, and it looks, I'm not a lawyer, but I don't understand how that would be legal. Why weren't charges brought against Giuliani? Does he possibly face legal exposure now?
You know, I've heard internal conversations at the Justice Department in the past year where, you know, Bill Barr, who was key to all of this, expressed frustration that he essentially saved Donald Trump's presidency, and then Donald Trump went and screwed it up. And what he's referring to is this, because
this is where he saved it.
This is where he saved it. He managed, right, when this first comes to the attention of the Justice Department through a whistleblower complaint, which then gets sent from the Director of National Intelligence to the Justice Department. What they do behind the scenes, unbeknownst to us, they spend a couple of weeks making sure that when this was finally made public, and that Congress, by the way, was not told yet, when they were finally able to tell the public about this, that everything had already been done behind the scenes. And they came out immediately and told us that they investigated and determined that there was nothing to see here. That was a huge thing that the Justice Department did, because what it has done essentially is let Giuliani, let Trump skate by until now that, you know, some of this is now perhaps coming to becoming public. And also, obviously, Giuliani is still under investigation by the Southern District of New York.
Which it bears repeating because we said it so much at the time. Obviously, this whole discussion is about the first Trump impeachment, or led to the first Trump impeachment. But what you just said is, I mean, it's really remarkable that the Attorney General of the United States planned this all, or at least protected a lot of these people so that he could save his presidency, which he messed up. That was such a potent message that Joe Biden took to the American people. On the way that the Justice Department, one of the messages he had, how the Justice Department was totally tainted by politics. And that's why you're seeing it being approached in a completely different way. Not saying that it's necessarily going to have different outcomes with regard to the Justice Department probes of various things, but he's hands off, and that's why.
All right, Dana Bash, Evan Perez, thanks so much to both of you. Coming up next, he's being called the new Mitch McConnell by a fellow Democrat. It's not meant as a compliment. The frustration in the party over Senator Joe Manchin, that's next. Plus, billionaire Jeff Bezos can go practically anywhere on Earth he wants, so naturally he wants to leave Earth and fly to outer space. That's ahead. In our politics lead, progressives are firing at Senator Joe Manchin after the West Virginia Democrat effectively killed a sweeping election reform bill. One freshman Democratic Congressman, Mondaire Jones of New York, accused Manchin of voting to, quote, preserve Jim Crow. Another freshman Democratic Congressman, Jamal Bowman, called him the, quote, new Mitch McConnell, not meant as a compliment. Now, as CNN's Phil Mattingly reports, President Biden's legislative agenda faces an even tougher path forward.
He's come down quite a bit. We're looking to see more.
With President Biden's sweeping legislative agenda in limbo, a critical week ahead.
So lots going on right now, but still lots of daylight, honestly, between us and our Republican friends.
As some Democratic allies worry, the window for action is closing. But for now, Biden's sticking with bipartisan talks.
There's no, hardwired deadline. We are doing the work of legislating. This is a big week.
Biden's scheduled to speak with top GOP negotiator Senator Shelley Moore Capito early this week, as the two sides remain, in the words of one official involved, in different universes on a potential deal. The call will be the first since Biden rejected outright a GOP proposal to increase its offer by roughly $50 billion.
He certainly is eager to see what that discussion can entail.
But that offer left the two sides still more than $700 billion apart after Biden tried to break the logjam, suggesting he'd drop his original offer by roughly $1 trillion. It took changes to the 2017 tax law off the table, a central GOP ask. The White House now open to other bipartisan talks, including a Senate group that includes Senator Joe Manchin, a linchpin vote for Biden's agenda, who has rejected calls for the president to end bipartisan negotiations.
I think we can come to that compromise to where we'll find a bipartisan deal. I'm very, very confident of that.
But the clock is ticking. And without Manchin on board, Biden's options with the slimmest congressional majorities are limited. With infrastructure talks just one piece of the $4 trillion economic agenda Biden wants passed by the end of this summer.
Ultimately, we're looking to have enough of a coalition to move forward on these bold, historic ideas. And we obviously don't have that at this moment, but we're working toward that.
And Jake, Senator Capito just told our Capitol Hill colleagues Kristen Wilson and Ted Barrett she will speak to the president tomorrow. And it's worth noting White House officials are keenly aware of the dynamics here. They hear the pressure from progressives to move on, but they know no matter how large the ambitions, how much support you have from key interest parties of inside your own party, nothing happens if you don't have the votes. And right now, they don't have the votes. And as one administration official told me, Biden is aware that at this point in time, deploying some strategic patience is an absolute necessity. Jake?
All right, Phil Mattingly, thanks so much. Let's talk for a second, if we can, about election reform, Paul and Amanda, because there's just so much anger at Senator Joe Manchin about this bill. Now, this bill it's very long, it's very sweeping, there's a lot in there. It includes things that are not related to election reform, like requiring presidential candidates to disclose their taxes, ethics rules for members of the Supreme Court. There's a lot in there, and I'm not saying I agree or disagree with any of it. What do you think, if you were, let's say you were Senate Democratic leader, okay? I know you're not a Democrat. But let's say you're Senate Democratic leader, and you wanted to pass something to preserve the election rights that are being, let's be fair, eroded in various state legislatures by Republicans. That's just a fact. They're making it tougher for people to vote. What would you do?
I would start with a skinny H.R. 1 bill that focuses only on the actual election administration issues. I mean, the biggest problems we're facing have to do with access to the ballot. H.R. 1 was always a non-starter because it contained just a giant wish list of all these liberal voting items that had been on the shelf long before Donald Trump started his big election lie. So I would take out all the parts that actually address the problems from the last election and focus on that. And I think you could actually get a lot of the way there. You'd either do a skinny H.R. 1 or a John Lewis Voting Rights Plus. Because the biggest problem that I think liberals should be panicked about are these state legislatures that are enacting these laws at the last minute with very little debate, very little disclosure that restricts voting. And so if you put those pre-clearance checks back in place that the John Lewis Voting Act would do, I think that gets you some of the way. But here's the problem. This is not a problem that Washington can solve with one big bill because the states administer the elections. Yeah. And so in conjunction, they should also be talking about what is their expectation that voters should have for access to the ballot across the country when it comes to early voting, ballot design, mail-in ballots, audits, because every state is so different. This is how they get so wrapped around the axle on it. No one knows what voters should be entitled to. And so just start thinking about that.
So, yeah, Paul, let me just posit that I assume you support H.R. 1 and everything.
Wholeheartedly.
Okay. But you're Senate Majority Leader.
Right.
You got Joe Manchin, you got Kristen Sinema, you have a bunch of Democrats who aren't voicing it. But for instance, take a listen to Angus King. Okay, he's the independent senator from Maine. He caucuses with the Democrats. I asked him about this yesterday. Mm-hmm. Do you support the bill as written?
No, I think there are things that can be modified, and Chuck Schumer knows that, and Amy Klobuchar. I've said that all along. It's a 800 or 900 or 1,000-page bill. There are clearly some things I think need to be negotiated, and I think Joe Manchin realizes that.
So my point is it's not just Joe Manchin, right? It's not just Joe Manchin, and there are Democratic election officials in the states who say this bill is not what we need right now. Your Senate Majority Leader, your Democratic leader, what do you do?
What I do is I get those old Schoolhouse Rock videos out and teach people again how a bill becomes a law, right? This thing needs negotiation. I'm for the bill completely.
Well, it passed the House in March.
It did,
but it can't pass the Senate.
I'm not a reporter, but I have spoken to people who wrote the bill and about Manchin, and they said to me, "We're open for business." Okay, they want to negotiate with Senator Manchin and others. The people who are pushing this, they've told me Manchin was a Secretary of State in his state. He had a very good, progressive, pro-voting rights record. They don't view him as an enemy. I know some of the left are attacking him, but
they say he's in favor of Jim Crow.
This is, which is preposterous. This is what you have to do. They have to sit down and negotiate, though. And I love that they come on your show, but they need to negotiate face to face rather than through State of the Union.
So. One Republican who supports the John Lewis Voting Act is Senator Lisa Murkowski, Republican of Alaska. But the other question, the other counter argument, I hear what you're saying, okay? But the counter argument is there aren't 10 Republican votes in the Senate for anything having to do with election reform. And that's what they say. There aren't 10 Amanda Carpenters, okay? There aren't 10 conservatives who believe in getting as many people to the polls as possible who can legally vote. This is what they say. They're saying they just don't exist.
Yeah, I mean, but you have to start with something that can bring Republicans to the table to even talk about it. H.R. 1 is the easiest thing for Senate Republicans to dismiss. I've seen the mailing coming to Joe Manchin about H.R. 1 saying this would allow the federal government to take over elections. West Virginia county clerks are saying they don't want this. It is not popular in his state. And he's saying, listen, I support the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. And so start with something that gets Democrats to the table before you even start worrying about Republicans. And then maybe you get a Murkowski, and then you have to do some public relations. Then you have to do some strong arm politics. And if you can't do that, and I understand that, and I understand the frustration that Democrats have with Manchin, because I want to see some voting reform passed too.
He's your senator.
Yeah, and also, it's difficult because if you can't find 60 votes for a January 6th commission to protect the institution, I'm not sure other people care about voting, which is why I think once you try that, if it doesn't work, you have to pivot to a state-based campaign and make sure that the Democrats win those governorships, because that's going to matter much more when it comes to protecting voting rights than anything else.
The John Lewis bill is only half it. It only will solve future problems, not the bills that these states are passing today. You have to do both, but they have to make a deal. And Manchin says it's too partisan. And I understand that, but it's too partisan because the Republicans have made it partisan. The last Voting Rights Act passed 98-0 with George W. Bush signing it. Yeah. It was Republicans who've changed on voting rights, not Democrats.
Different Republican Party. Yeah. Paul Begala, Amanda Carpenter, thanks so much. Today in our Earth Matters series, what may be one of the worst drought seasons on record out west. In California alone, drought monitors show extreme conditions right now in 74% of the state. At Lake Oroville, north of Sacramento, known for its boat life, water levels in 2011 on the left look nothing like they do now 10 years later on the right. It's not just California, though, as CNN's Stephanie Elam reports. In Utah, conditions are so bad, the governor is literally asking residents to pray for a miracle.
Cracks sprawl along empty baked basins, parched farms, and depleted reservoirs, all symptoms of a historic drought.
Most definitely what we have seen develop in 2020 and 2021 is definitely worse than what we saw in the early 2000s.
In California, Old lines etched the sides of reservoirs, marking where the water once reached.
The hots are getting a lot hotter in this state. The dries are getting a lot drier.
The water in Lake Oroville, the second largest reservoir in the state, is dropping so quickly, locals say they can practically see it disappearing.
If you look out in the distance, you can see where the lake should be.
The reservoir, which provides water to 29 million Californians and irrigates some 750,000 acres, may get so low, officials will have to shut down its hydroelectric power plant by the end of August. Officials warn reservoirs across the state are at about half of where they would be in a normal year.
We're in our second straight dry year. The dryness of this year, or the lack of rain and snow this winter, really ranks as one of California's driest winters.
But it's not just California that's dangerously dry.
One of the real differences with this drought versus other droughts is this is region-wide. This drought is impacting the entire American West. And in fact, conditions are even more concerning in the Colorado River Basin, which seven states rely on.
According to the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, the Colorado River Basin is in its 22nd year of drought, evident by Lake Mead's receding waterline. The National Drought Monitor Center keeps tabs on the severity of the lack of water across the country. The deeper the color, the worse the drought.
Is it possible that the drought won't break, that will just keep getting worse each year?
The Western U.S. is prone to these long-term drought events, but they do come out. And so we think about that in the back of our minds, that is this, year 20 or is this year 20 of 40?
That's the case in Utah, where 90% of the state is entrenched in extreme drought.
We need more rain, and we need it now.
So much so, the governor is asking Utahns to pray for rain.
We need some divine intervention.
Divine intervention for a largely man-made problem. And there is another big concern related to this drought, and that is the fact that we are going into the hot summer months, which means wildfires could be rampant because everything out here is so dry. And also, just as a little side note here, it drizzled here in Los Angeles today, but not nearly enough to make a difference. And that's why in parts of California, you may see that some municipalities may see restrictions on their water usage moving forward. Jake.
All right, Stephanie Elam in Los Angeles, thank you so much. In our health lead, the FDA has just approved the use of an experimental drug to fight early stages of Alzheimer's disease. The drug is intended to actually slow progression of Alzheimer's, not just ease symptoms. This is the first drug related to Alzheimer's disease to get FDA approval in nearly 20 years. CNN's Elizabeth Cohen joins us now. Elizabeth, you say this is a significant development for the fight against Alzheimer's, but we should also note it's a controversial one. This drug was shot down for FDA approval just a year ago.
It was. A team of advisors to the FDA, Jake, said, no, we don't think you should approve this drug, essentially. And the FDA hardly ever goes against its advisors, so this makes this really notable. Let's take a look at why the FDA advisors said they didn't think that this should be approved. There were two studies that were done on this drug where it was compared with placebo to see which did better. And the first study found there was no benefit to the drug. It didn't do any better than just a placebo. The second study found that there was a 22% reduction in cognitive decline. Now, the question is, does that 22% make a difference? Do people even feel that? So let's take a look again at some of these specifics. Again, it was approved against the advice of FDA advisors. The approval, the FDA said, was based on the reduction of amyloid plaques in the brain. They said you could see that there were fewer of these plaques and tangles, the telltale sign of Alzheimer's. And they said theoretically that means that it should make a difference, that people should feel a difference and have less cognitive decline. The annual cost, a heavy price tag of $56,000. Insurance companies, of course, will reimburse it at varying rates. The concern, Jake, is that doctors will hear from patients or from family members of patients with advanced Alzheimer's who will want this drug. This drug is not for advanced Alzheimer's. It's for very early stages. The concern is that doctors will give in to patients, because in the U.S. that happens a lot. Doctors like to make patients happy, and that it's these kinds of unnecessary high-priced drug prescriptions that make drug costs go up, really, for all of us. Jake?
All right, Elizabeth, thank you so much. Turning now to our world lead. Benjamin Netanyahu's decade-long grip on power in Israel seems to be slipping away. His opposition, led by right-wing Naftali Bennett, created a coalition with centrist Yair Lapid to form a government that is set to topple Netanyahu's government. The deadline for the official vote is next week, and Netanyahu is doing anything and everything he can to stay in power. CNN's Hadass Gold is in Jerusalem following this. And Hadass, Prime Minister Netanyahu, he's now calling the opposition, quote, far left. He's saying there was election fraud. This sounds very familiar to a lot of people in the United States.
Jake, the Trump echoes have been quite loud in the past few days. Netanyahu even using a term like deep state and saying the fact that right-wing parties are willing to sit with political parties like from the left is a scam on their voters. Listen to what he described it as.
We are witnessing the greatest election fraud in the history of the country. In my opinion, in the history of any democracy.
The rhetoric has reached such a level, though, Jake, that there is real fear here that Israel could experience the mob-style violence that happened at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. And it's reached such a point there have been demonstrations outside of the homes of some members of this coalition. Some of them have been assigned even extra security. And in a very rare and unprecedented public statement, the head of Israel's internal security said that an intense